Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of the series Criminal Justice Reform, one of ACMi's public affairs series that deals with important issues in and around us. And my guest today is Lori Kenschaft. It's probably overdue to have had her on because Lori has been instrumental in our construction of this series in facilitating various of the guests that facilitating contact with various of the guests that we've already spoken to over the time. And so, as I said, it is long overdue. Lori, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. What we'd like to focus on is here at First Parish Church, right here in the center of town, is the Mass Incarceration Working Group that again has been the nexus in a lot of ways for the connections that we have made for this series with various, I don't want to call them players, but actors at various levels of addressing the various issues within our criminal justice system, including mass incarceration and many others that we can talk about a little bit more. But today we'd like to focus and get your sense and your narrative on the group itself. What is its history? How does it function? What kinds of things can you point to as successes? What stuff is still lying in front of you, et cetera? So with that rather broad introduction, let me welcome you to just kind of tell us what are the origins of the working group.
Certainly, thank you very much. Just about 5 years ago, a group of people at First Parish Unitarian Universalist of Arlington got together to read what was then a fairly new book, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, the Age of Colorblindness. And out of that conversation came a lot of concern, outrage, illumination, some people very angry, some people very hurt, feeling pain about what was going on. And several people said, we want to do something about this. So we said, okay, let's see if we can form a group and figure out what we might do about this. And that is an evolving process, of course, in the birth of any new group. You take a while to figure out whether it can function as a group and what it's going to do. But it's now been 5 years, and I think we have existed. And we've really had 3 chapters thus far. And I think there's a 4th one that's just beginning. So if I may, I'd like to tell you.
Please.
The first chapter was, as I said, just sort of getting our feet underneath us, learning more than what was in the book, learning what's going on here in Massachusetts, because the book is about the whole country. And one of the things we realized very early is that we had to make connection with formerly incarcerated people, most of us in the group don't have that level of personal experience with this system. And we needed to connect with people who do and listen to them, learn from them. So we connected with the Jobs Not Jails Coalition, which at that point was relatively new. We connected with EPICA, Ex-Prisoners and Prisoners Organizing for Community Advancement, which is based in Worcester, and is a founding group in the Jobs Not Jails Coalition. And we were involved in organizing a workshop that was attended by 100 people, the training workshop for Jobs Not Jails. And we hosted one of the things that most made me feel honored was when EPICA asked us to host their 10th anniversary celebration in our sanctuary. And it was such a powerful evening of people from such different backgrounds, such different experiences, different classes, colors, coming together and sharing good food from Haley House and inspirational speakers and connecting in ways that people often don't connect. So that was very powerful. We realized from listening to people that this wasn't just about incarceration. Incarceration certainly matters, and by now we've heard a lot about how many people this country locks up and how damaging that is. It extends beyond that, though, to control of people by the criminal justice system, which is also much higher in this country. If you're on probation or if you have fines and fees, these things can really warp a life too. When somebody has to pay fines and fees they really can't afford, so they have to decide, am I going to pay this, or am I going to pay for rent or electricity or groceries or my kids' new shoes for school? Or that those are really painful choices. Probation, showing up for probation appointments, this, that, and the other. What happens if it's when you're supposed to be at work? Do you skip the appointment and risk going back to jail, or do you skip work and risk losing your job?
Really tough questions.
Really tough decisions. And people face this over and over. And even short times. This research shows that spending just 2 nights in jail really increases the chance that somebody will be involved in the criminal justice system in the future. That just in 2 nights you can lose your job, lose your income, lose your housing, maybe even lose your custody of your kids because of those 2 nights. And then as your life falls apart, you're much more likely to do other things that end you up back in that situation. So it is certainly a matter of mass incarceration per se, but it's much broader than that. And I call it the whole culture of excessive punishment, that we are so hard on people when they make mistakes. Some of the people who are involved in this system didn't do anything, just were in the wrong place at the wrong time and got fingered. Some people are being over-punished for little offenses. The classic stories are driving while black and you have one of your taillights isn't working, and that sort of cascades into really big consequences for your life. And sure, you should have your taillights working, but the punishment shouldn't be like that.
Right.
And some people have done real harm to other people, and we started to grapple with that. And we know that the court system, the prison system, the probation system often leaves people feeling defensive, resentful, additionally damaged. We know that people who hurt other people have often been hurt themselves. And as a community grounded in a religious community, we felt we needed to deal with those issues of the spirit and of humanity, not just courts and prisons. And this led us to really focus on restorative justice for our second chapter. For a full year, we did a whole series of programs on restorative justice. And restorative justice takes many different forms depending on the programs, but it's fundamentally about healing. It's fundamentally about people taking real responsibility, real accountability, to understand the effects of their actions on other people, and then do what they can to make the situation right. This has been enormously powerful for many people. It has, if you just measure it by recidivism is much lower in places where people use restorative justice than if they punish people. Punishment tends to make somebody even more warped.
And if I can just interject, I just for those in our audience for whom it might not be transparently clear what restorative justice is, and although you've described it, I think that as we have spoken to Police Chief Ryan here in town and others who champion restorative justice in the same way as you're doing, it's clear that what you're doing is bringing, rather than concentrating on the punishment, you're bringing together the perpetrator of the harm, the victims, and then other professionals who can facilitate that those interactions, and you're extending that over time, such that the perpetrator is really understanding the harm that he or she has caused, and also the victim has a chance to really get something much more satisfying and fulfilling out of that interaction than simply watching things proceed through a courtroom, et cetera.
Exactly. And a couple years ago, I heard somebody from the MBTA talk about a restorative justice pilot program they were using with assaults and thefts that occurred on the T. And sometimes as a clear offender, clear victim, and sometimes it's one of those things that escalated. But in either case, he talked about how in the court system, you never say you're sorry. You never look somebody in the eye and say you're sorry, because that's all about guilt and punishment, and how much are you going to get punished and branded? And so people get self-protective under those circumstances. And the restorative justice process that they were using, he said, the person, if it was mutual or one way, always ended up saying, I'm sorry, looking the person in the eye and saying, I'm sorry. Usually they ended up crying. Usually they ended up hugging. And at the time he spoke, the program had been around for a year and it had a 0% recidivism rate. That's just huge. That's changing people's lives and that's changing people's spirits. So that, I think, is going to be a necessary part of any effective criminal justice system, criminal legal system, but it's going beyond the legal to actually helping people. And as you said, it's often much more satisfying if whoever's been hurt at the recipient end of these things to actually engage with the person and feel like they understand, feel like they're trying to make it right. That helps you let it go in a way that just seeing somebody go to prison doesn't. So we've spent a lot of time, and as you know, we're connected with Communities for Restorative Justice and Police Chief Fred Ryan, but it's also, that's not the only way to do restorative justice. The third chapter is focusing on criminal justice legislation, which, as you know, there have been big omnibus bills working their way through the State House, first passed by the Senate, then passed by the House, now currently, as we speak, in conference committee, may come out of conference committee at any time, and they're really huge. And this is something we've actually worked on all the way through at both of the last two legislative cycles. In March, at the beginning of the cycle, we did a big legislative forum. The last one was last March, and we had 300 people come and talk about what would comprehensive criminal justice reform look like. And we've been calling for comprehensive reform, and we didn't know whether that was viable, but these omnibus bills are pretty comprehensive. They're not perfect, they're not complete, they don't address parole, they're not going to be perfect, but they're much bigger than we had thought would be possible when we started this 5 years ago. And we have been working for that in a lot of different ways, particularly those forums, but in also many other different ways, hosting workshops on how to be an effective citizen lobbyist with various legislators, and really trying to encourage people to get involved in the legislative process, because that's how a democracy really works, is if citizens get involved. So the fourth chapter, as I said, is coming up. We're not going to let go of any of those. It's still important to be engaged with people who are formerly incarcerated themselves. It's still important to expand people's understanding of restorative justice and to work on this legislation and the legislation that will have to come after it. But we're more and more aware that legislation alone will not solve this problem, that a lot of it has to do with how systems and institutions work, on policies and practices, on training, on assumptions. Police Chief Fred Ryan talks about this a lot in terms of policing, that it's important to train police to see themselves as guardians of the community, providing fair policing for everybody, and what he calls procedural justice, not just he, but procedural justice, which if you're coming from a Jewish background might be called doing justice in a just way. And he focuses, the Arlington Police Department focuses on making sure that people who have substance abuse difficulties get into treatment. It supports restorative justice. This is all part of developing a policing system that really protects the entire community, which, as we all know, is not always what people experience the police as doing. And the same thing is true for every other part of the criminal legal system, that ideally this is all about protecting the community. It isn't always functioning like that. And one of the key players in all of this is district attorneys and prosecutors more generally, that they have enormous discretion in what they charge somebody with, how they charge them, what penalties they ask for. There was a whole period of time where in this country the crime rate was going down, the violence rate was going down, the arrest rate was going down, and the incarceration rate was going up. And that was because prosecutors were getting more and more rigorous in what they prosecuted people for. So that needs to backtrack.
People know as the broken windows.
Broken windows. Also, people, when they have a lot of discretion, pushing the edge, charging people with felonies when they could have been done a misdemeanor. Once you have a record as a felon, it's really hard to get jobs, housing, education, training. That's a huge scarlet letter. And prosecutors often have discretion about whether to call something a felony or call something a misdemeanor. It just makes a huge difference in somebody's life.
Yeah.
So even as the violent rates was going down, the felony rate was going up. That had to do with prosecutors' decisions. And so we need to encourage...
Those can't be legislated, obviously.
Those can't be legislated. That's a matter of what do the prosecutors think the public want them to do. District attorneys in Massachusetts and most states are elected. They're responding to what they perceive to be public expectations, public pressures, public wants. And our goal is to send a different message, change what the public wants, and send a message that the public wants a criminal legal system that honestly protects people but doesn't break people for small offenses, doesn't destroy people's lives for relatively small reasons. We've gone too far in all of this punishment, incarceration and the rest of the spectrum as well. We've gone too far. So part of that, again, comes back to restorative justice. There's been a lot of discussion recently about pretrial reform. Should somebody be held on bail should somebody be held pre-trial before they've been found guilty? Under what conditions? If somebody poses a danger, or there's good evidence to believe that somebody poses a danger to the community or to somebody in particular, then it makes sense to hold them pre-trial. But that is a constitutional issue.
Right, and I think, as we know, the vast majority of people being held pre-trial are being held for other reasons, specifically that they can't afford a bail that's been set.
Exactly.
In many cases.
And last August, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled in the Brangen decision that bail had to be affordable, that you couldn't hold somebody just because bail isn't affordable. But the Massachusetts Bail Fund is still bailing out people who've been set a bail of $200, $300, $400, $500. They don't do bail over $500, and they still have lots of customers. And if somebody is being held on bail for $400, that means they didn't do something too very terrible. Well, we don't know whether they did it or not, but they haven't even been accused of something too very terrible. So it's something minor. And if they're being held until the Mass Bail Fund comes along, that means they can't afford it, because otherwise they would have been out. So we know that there seems to be some progress, but we also know that people are still being held on very small bails. So that is an example. Those decisions, they're made by judges, but the prosecutors go and ask for what they think the bail should be. And with the number of decisions that a judge makes per day, they rely very heavily on the recommendations of prosecutors. So our group has connected with the ACLU of Massachusetts and a whole group of other groups to create a campaign called What a Difference a DA Makes. And that,
That's
yes.
good.
And that's being led by the ACLU of Massachusetts. It's actually a priority of the ACLU nationally, but also here in Massachusetts. And we are a partner organization in that, and we'll be continuing to raise awareness of this. What prosecutors do, how important they are, how much power and discretion they have, how much they really shape what happens. The district attorney elections are in November, or September for the primaries, November for the general elections this year. They're all, and there's 11 of them in Massachusetts, and they're all up for election. And that's a good opportunity to talk about what makes a good district attorney and what makes good prosecutors. And part of it is about who's in the office, but also any person in an office changes how they behave based on what they think the public wants from them. So it's partly about using the election to raise up an actual election, but it's also about using it to change the conversation and encourage prosecutors to think really carefully about the impact of their decisions on the community as a whole.
So I'd like to dig in a little bit more on the working group itself. And
Please.
First of all, I think the title says a lot all by itself. You guys could have come together and called yourselves any number of things, but you chose working group, which clearly implies there's work to be done here, and there's action to be taken. I assume then that you have to kind of keep the numbers within the working group manageable, low enough so that you can reach consensus relatively quickly around something and then take action. Is that the case? How many people comprise what we talk of as, or what we are referring to as the Mass Incarceration Working Group?
I can think of it as sort of two circles or maybe three circles. There's the core group, which I call the core group or steering group, whatever you want to call it. And that usually has about 10 active members at any given time. It's changed over the course of 5 years. But that's a good number for working together, sharing the load, but really being able to talk with each other. We have an email list of about 800 people statewide, mostly Eastern Massachusetts, but people who have come to our events or otherwise expressed interest in our work. And we send them 1 to 3 emails a month with information about action opportunities related to ending mass incarceration or creating better alternatives here in Massachusetts. We focus just on Massachusetts because we feel like this is where we can have an impact, unlike the federal level. And I would argue that everybody who ever takes action in any of those ways is also part of the working group, because we're about making change. Our mission is to help end the mass incarceration in Massachusetts, to build a movement that helps end mass incarceration in Massachusetts. So that larger circle is also part of our group. The number of people come to a meeting, 8 or 10 typically.
And I'm wondering, you've already mentioned that you are, embarking on the cusp of your 4th chapter of work. Is there anything else that you'd like to kind of bring up that's on your radar as a working group, as another issue you want to tackle, or another aspect of this situation that that is ripe for action?
I think 3 is enough. Continuing to pay attention to the legislative issues, which will need continued attention, restorative justice, prosecutors in particular. In the broader scheme, that also needs to focus on all the other institutions that are involved. What actually happens in prisons? There's solitary confinement reforms that are going to be in this omnibus bill, I believe. Not sure exactly, but I believe so, because it's in both the House and Senate versions. But then how does that put into practice? All sorts of things of how does the probation system actually work? How does the parole system actually work? And there will need to be lots of people who focus on getting visibility on things. One of the things that activists have been working on, and that the legislation I hope will help with, is collecting data. We know so little about who is in the system, how long they stay, what's happening to them, and the demographics of them. There are so many questions that would come up easily in an interview, and I would have to say, I don't know, and nobody knows, because the data isn't being collected. One of my big hopes is that the legislation will mandate collection of good data uniform throughout the state, one computer system that can talk to each other from all the different agencies with good demographic data, and then we can start to analyze some of these issues. We know, based on the very basic data that we have, that the racial disparities in incarceration rates in Massachusetts are higher than typical for the country. For Latinos, we have the highest disparities between incarceration rate and proportion of the population. We have no ability to figure out how or why that's occurring, because we don't have the granularity of understanding how the system is working. So those issues are huge, and I'm not going to pretend that our group is going to take them all on. But they do need to be taken on. And that was another thing I wanted to say in this, that the whole question about effectiveness in a democracy, and what's the role of citizen groups in a democracy. I believe that citizenship matters. That's partly a matter of faith, that democracy is in some sense a faith system, but it works better if we believe in it. But it's also, how does one know whether one's making a difference? People want to feel like they're making a difference. And I'm not going to claim that our group is the reason that this legislation occurred. I mean, obviously not. We would have, to some degree, we didn't need to exist for this legislation to occur. I do think we've had some impact. And in a democracy, you can't pull that apart to say what exactly. But for example, a couple years ago, a staff member at the State House said to me that this group is why all 3 of Arlington's State House legislators are putting a priority on criminal justice reform. They all cared about it before that, but legislators have so many things on their plate, so many agendas, so many priorities. And the weight that they put on something depends a lot on what they're hearing from their constituents about what's important to their constituents. So we have 3 very important, effective legislators at the State House who have put more priority on this, I believe, because of our group, not just our little 8 or 10, but when they come to an event at our place and there's dozens or hundreds of people, that's a statement about the public's priorities. A couple years ago, the National Association of Social Workers, Massachusetts chapter, gave our group a Public Citizen of the Year award, saying, it's not just, they usually give it to an individual, but this was about the group and about how we have created that network and nurtured that network that's helped change public opinion. Last summer, early last spring, Representative Sean Garbely nominated me for the Unsung Heroine Award of the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, which they gave me. And it was largely for this work. And I don't, I look at how do you calibrate what you're doing? Well, I look at these things and I say, well, other people think we're part of the conversation. Other people think we're making a difference. And I can't say, oh, this provision in that bill is there because of us. It doesn't work like that. But I really believe that citizen involvement in the legislative process does make a difference. Really, really makes a difference. And so that's one of the take-home messages I'd like to send whoever's watching this is about this issue. Obviously, I think this issue is really important. I also think that democracy is really important. I really think that citizen involvement is really important. And what has surprised me is the more that I got involved at the State House and seeing the details of what happened, the better I felt about the process. I thought that I'd see sausage making and go, oh, I need to cover my nose. And no, I found myself thinking these are admirable people trying to do the right thing under difficult circumstances, and I have some opinions about what the right thing might be, and they seem to be listening.
So that's a great kind of overview of all the things that the working group has been up to for the 5 years of its existence. But I know that you've got an event specifically that we're pointing towards coming up here in early to mid-February. Why don't you tell us about that, including the actual information about the event itself, but also what the content is expected to be, et cetera.
Certainly. We're framing it as a celebration of progress towards justice. Certainly we haven't gotten there. We're not at the promised land, but if we wait till then, we'll never celebrate. And people need to celebrate occasionally.
That's right.
And there's two reasons we're celebrating. One is it's our 5th anniversary. Good reason enough. Another is that this omnibus bill is working its way through. We don't know when it's going to come out, but it's gotten this far, and that's fabulous. And as I said earlier, this is much further than we thought was going to be possible 5 years ago.
Yeah, and let me interject just to say, I first heard about this even as a possibility, or started having these conversations with you and others maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and this did not look like it was on the horizon at all at that point. So,
exactly. Even last spring, in March, I wasn't at all confident that we would lead to anything like this in terms of how broad it is. So. It's a big deal. We would be delighted to have anybody who's interested join us. This is open to everyone who is willing to come with a celebratory open spirit.
Sounds like First Parish Church to me.
Yes, absolutely. It's on Sunday, February 11th from 2 to 4:30 p.m. And the spoken program will start around 3 o'clock to 3:30. So in some sense, it's a party. You're welcome to come whenever you want, leave whenever you want. But if you can be there from 3 to 3:30, that's when the heart of it will be. But 2 to 4:30 p.m. on Sunday, February 11th at the First Parish Unitarian Universalist of Arlington, located at 630 Mass Ave in Arlington Center.
That's right, smack dab in the middle of Arlington Center. And really, I think on its way to becoming, in some ways, an icon of Arlington, because it really has been the center of a lot of this kind of work and just general. There's a strong social activism spirit within the Arlington populace, I think, and a lot of that finds its most visible and most vocal kind of expression emanating in and around the First Parish Church, I've noticed.
Well, I'm delighted and honored to hear that you have that perception, because that's part of what we want to do. We are a religious community and we have multiple purposes. We call it balancing inwards, sidewards, and outwards, spirituality, community, and living our faith in the world outside our walls. And what you're saying is that third of one, we're doing pretty well. Thank you.
That's great. For Lori Kenschaft and the Mass Incarceration Working Group, and in anticipatory celebration of the event on February 11th, I'm James Milan. We thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.